Some inheritances arrive wrapped in velvet and silver, but the ones that change a life often come disguised as something everyone else was glad to throw away. The first snow of the season fell without sound over Pine Hollow, covering the ridge roads, the black pine branches, and the roof of the old log cabin that Nathan Cole had been told was not worth the nails holding it together. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving only a red pulse beneath the ash. Nathan lay awake on a narrow cot near the stone hearth, one arm folded beneath his head, listening to the cabin settle around him. He was 40 years old, a white male veteran with a calm, weathered face, short brown hair, light stubble, wearing a worn dark field jacket over a plain cotton shirt and faded jeans, though the jacket now hung from a peg by the door, damp from the long drive up the ridge. Sleep had never come easily to him, not in barracks, not in cheap motel rooms, not in the cab of his old pickup when money ran thinner than gas. But this place had a silence he did not trust yet. It was too full. Too aware. Beside the hearth, Duke suddenly lifted his head. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was a strong, athletic dog with a silver-gray and cream coat, upright ears, alert amber eyes, and a calm, loyal expression that could make a room feel guarded even when nothing moved. He stared toward the far side of the cabin, where the north wall disappeared into shadow. Nathan opened his eyes fully. "You hear something, boy?" Duke did not bark. He stood, crossed the worn floorboards, and lowered his nose to the wood. Then he began to scrape at one plank with slow, deliberate strokes. Not frantic. Not playful. Certain. Nathan sat up, the cold air touching his face. Outside, snow whispered against the window glass. The old cabin creaked once, long and low, as if answering the dog from somewhere beneath the floor. Nathan pulled on his boots, took the lantern from the crate he was using as a nightstand, and turned the flame up until amber light spread over the room. The cabin looked smaller in that glow, one room, rough-hewn logs, a sagging shelf, a table with one uneven leg, a rusted cookstove, and a kind of loneliness that did not come from being empty, but from being forgotten for too long. Duke scraped again. Nathan knelt beside him and ran his palm over the plank. The wood was colder than the rest of the floor, and beneath his fingers he felt the faintest tremor. Not machinery. Not an animal. A small, steady vibration, like the memory of a heartbeat trapped under old timber. He reached for his pocket knife and worked the blade carefully along the seam. The board lifted easier than it should have, revealing a square cut beneath, hidden under years of dust. Duke stepped back and sat ears high, amber eyes locked on the opening. Nathan slid his hand inside and touched metal. He drew out a thin plate no larger than an envelope, blackened with age but wrapped in oilcloth. When he wiped it clean, 4 words appeared first, carved deep into the surface, not worthless. Just waiting. Below that, in smaller letters, another line had been scratched by a careful hand, for the one who would stay. Nathan stared at the words until the fire behind him gave a soft crackle and sent a ribbon of sparks up the chimney. The air in the cabin seemed to change. 2 days earlier, in Helen Brooks's law office downtown, his brother Mason had leaned back in a leather chair and laughed under his breath when that same cabin was read aloud as Nathan's inheritance. Mason received the lower pasture, the equipment shed, and the rights to the family's hay contracts. Rebecca received the main house on Cole Road, with its white porch, its clean windows, and every photograph Nathan had long ago stopped expecting to be included in. Nathan received the log cabin 7 miles up the ridge, a place no one had used since their father, Walter Cole, was strong enough to cut his own firewood. The room had gone quiet, not out of respect, but embarrassment. Mason had tapped the arm of his chair and said, "Well, at least he cannot lose much with that." Rebecca had looked down at her hands. Helen Brooks, gray-haired and stern behind her desk, had kept reading as if the words themselves deserved dignity even when the family did not. Nathan had said nothing. He had learned years ago that a man could spend his whole life trying to prove he was not the least important person in the room and still leave tired. Duke had rested his head on Nathan's boot that day, the same way he did when the world grew too loud without raising its voice. Now, kneeling in the cabin Mason had called useless, Nathan turned the metal plate over. On the back was a small carving of a compass, and beneath it, his father's initials, W. C. Walter Cole had put this here. Not Mason. Not some old trapper or forgotten owner. His father. The man who had rarely called, rarely explained, and somehow managed to leave Nathan the one thing that now seemed to be speaking in his own hidden language. Nathan looked around the room again. The smoke-dark beams. The patched window. The north wall where Duke had first listened. The cabin no longer felt like a leftover. It felt like a locked box, and he had just heard the first click. He set the plate on the table, then lowered his hand onto Duke's head. The dog's fur was warm beneath his fingers, steady as breath. "What did he leave us, Duke?" Nathan whispered. Duke looked toward the north wall again, calm and certain. Outside, snow kept falling over Pine Hollow, softening the ridge, covering the tire tracks, quieting the road behind them. But inside the forgotten cabin, beneath old boards and colder memories, something had begun to wake. Morning came slowly to the ridge, not with brightness, but with a pale gray hush that turned the windows silver and made the snow outside look untouched by the world. Nathan had not slept after finding the metal plate. He sat at the small table until dawn, the lantern burning low, Duke stretched beside the north wall with one ear still angled toward the floor. The words on the plate stayed in front of Nathan like a hand resting on his chest, not worthless. Just waiting. For the one who would stay. He had spent most of his life learning how to leave before being told he did not belong. He had left the family house at 18 with a duffel bag and a hard knot of pride. He had left towns when work dried up. He had left warm rooms before pity could settle on him. But this cabin, crooked and cold as it was, seemed to be asking the one thing no one in his family had asked of him in years. Stay. When daylight finally reached the cabin floor, Nathan stood and made coffee in a dented metal pot he found hanging near the stove. The smell was bitter and comforting, rising with the thin steam into rafters blackened by decades of wood smoke. He put another split log on the fire, fed Duke from a canvas pouch, then returned to the north wall where the dog had listened in the night. In daylight, the wall looked ordinary: stacked pine logs, chinking patched in 3 places, a crooked shelf holding a rusted lantern, a horseshoe, and an old coffee tin full of bent nails. But Duke did not treat it as ordinary. The German shepherd stood with his nose inches from the lower seam, breathing slowly, his silver gray and cream coat glowing softly in the firelight. Nathan ran his hand over the logs. One section near the corner had been sanded smoother than the rest. Not much. Just enough that a man trained to repair old things might notice. He moved the shelf aside and found a small compass mark carved into the wood, the same as the one on the metal plate. Beneath it, nearly hidden in the grain, was a narrow vertical cut. Nathan pressed his thumb along the seam. Nothing happened. Duke gave a quiet huff and nudged the old coffee tin with his nose. Nathan looked at it, then lifted it from the shelf. Under the nails lay a folded scrap of oilcloth. Inside was a brass key, dark with age, and a note in Walter Cole's careful block handwriting. North wall opens only when the cabin is warm. A cold heart misses what heat reveals. Nathan read the line twice, then looked toward the fire. The flames had grown stronger, and warmth was spreading slowly through the cabin. In the corner, where the smoother logs met the floor, a thin line of melted frost had begun to shine along the seam. Nathan waited, one hand on Duke's head, until the wood gave a soft pop. A hidden panel shifted open less than an inch. It was not dramatic. It did not swing wide like a treasure chest in a storybook. It simply loosened, as if the cabin had been holding its breath all night and finally trusted him enough to exhale. Nathan slipped the brass key into a small lock hidden behind the panel. It turned with a click so clean it startled him. Behind the wall was a shallow compartment lined with cedar. Inside rested a tin box, a folded map, a military compass with a cracked glass face, and a photograph wrapped in wax paper. Nathan took out the photograph first. It showed Walter Cole much younger, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, standing on the cabin porch in knee-deep snow. Beside him stood a small boy in a red knit hat, holding a stick like a flag. Duke leaned forward to sniff the picture. Nathan knew the boy before his mind was ready to accept it. Himself. 7 years old. First snow. The memory came back not as a full scene, but as warmth in pieces. His father's gloved hands tightening a scarf around his neck, the smell of pine sap, a fire snapping inside the cabin, his own laughter as he tried to build a fort beside the porch. He had not known the memory was still there. He had buried it under years of missed calls, hard words, empty chairs at family dinners, and the slow belief that Mason had become the son Walter wanted while Nathan became the one people explained away. On the back of the photograph, Walter had written Nathan, first snow on Coal Ridge, age 7. He stayed outside until his boots froze, then asked if cabins could remember people. Nathan sat down heavily on the nearest chair. Duke moved close, resting his head against Nathan's knee. For a long time, Nathan only held the photograph. The cabin did remember. It remembered a boy before he learned to measure love by what was left to him in a will. It remembered a father before silence became his language. The folded map lay beside the box, brittle at the creases but carefully marked. Nathan spread it across the table. It showed the cabin, the well, a narrow creek, the back shed, and a wide stand of walnut trees beyond the ridge, circled in blue pencil. At the bottom, Walter had written, "Do not sell the ridge before seeing what the trees are guarding." Nathan traced the circle with one finger. He knew enough about land to understand that trees could have value, but the note did not read like a timber estimate. It read like another door. A sound came from outside then, faint under the morning quiet. Tires on snow-packed gravel. Duke lifted his head, ears sharp. Nathan folded the map and slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket before stepping to the window. A familiar black truck climbed the ridge road and stopped near the cabin. Mason Cole stepped out wearing a clean wool coat and leather gloves, looking around the property with the expression of a man already deciding where everything should go. Behind him, Rebecca climbed from the passenger side, wrapped in a tan coat, her face drawn with unease. A third man Nathan did not recognize remained near the truck, holding a leather folder against his chest. Mason smiled when Nathan opened the door, but there was no warmth in it. "I figured I would come check on you," he said. "Make sure the roof has not fallen in yet." Nathan stood in the doorway, Duke beside his leg, calm and steady. Snow drifted from the porch roof in soft white threads. "Roof is still here." Mason's eyes moved past him into the cabin, quick and searching. "Heard from Helen that Dad left some old documents up here. Probably nothing, but family papers should stay with the family." Rebecca looked at Nathan then, and something like apology moved across her face. Nathan did not answer right away. He thought of the metal plate, the hidden photograph, the map, the words for the one who would stay. Then Duke stepped forward, not growling, not threatening, simply standing in the open doorway with the quiet authority of a guardian who had already chosen his side. Mason's smile thinned. The cabin fire crackled behind Nathan, warming the room, warming the cedar compartment in the north wall, warming truths that had waited a long time to be seen. Nathan placed one hand on the doorframe his father had once touched and said, "If there are family papers here, Mason, maybe it is time the family learned how to read them." Mason did not step inside right away. He stood on the porch with snow melting on the shoulders of his clean wool coat, his eyes moving from Nathan's face to Duke, then past them into the cabin where the fire had turned the old logs honeygold. Rebecca lingered behind him, her tan coat buttoned to her throat, her breath showing faintly in the cold. The third man from the truck stayed near the front fender, pretending to study the tree line while holding his leather folder a little too tightly. Nathan knew the type before anyone introduced him. Landman? Appraiser? Buyer? Someone who looked at hills and saw parcels, not memories. Duke remained at Nathan's side, quiet as stone, his alert amber eyes fixed not on Mason but on the stranger by the truck. "You brought company," Nathan said. Mason gave a small shrug. "Just someone who knows property values. No reason to get dramatic. I was making coffee, not drama. Rebecca looked down quickly, almost smiling despite herself, then looked away before Mason saw. The small moment softened something in Nathan, though not enough to make him foolish. Mason stepped forward at last, brushing past the doorframe without waiting to be invited. This place smells exactly like I remember, he said, but there was no tenderness in the words. Smoke, mice, and wet pine. Nathan closed the door behind Rebecca after she entered, leaving the stranger outside with the truck and the snow. The cabin suddenly felt crowded, not because it was small, but because the past had entered wearing familiar faces. Mason's gaze went straight to the table. The metal plate lay there beside the folded map, the brass key, and the photograph Nathan had not yet returned to the tin box. Mason picked up the plate before Nathan could stop him, read the carved words, and gave a short laugh that made the room feel colder. Dad and his riddles. He got worse near the end. Rebecca moved closer to the table. What is it? Nathan reached out, not sharply, and took the plate back from Mason's hand. Something he left under the floor. Rebecca's eyes widened. Under the floor? Mason's expression changed, quick as a curtain pulled across a window. That is exactly why I came. Old documents, buried items, anything tied to Dad's estate should be reviewed before you start claiming it means something. Nathan looked at his brother's clean gloves, the polished boots, the restless way he kept glancing toward the map. Who told you there were documents? Mason's jaw tightened. Helen mentioned Dad may have kept records up here. Rebecca turned to him. Helen told you that? Mason did not answer her. He picked up the folded map instead, opening it over the table as if the cabin already belonged to his hands. Duke stood then, not barking, just rising with such calm certainty that Rebecca took a step back and Mason froze. Nathan placed 2 fingers lightly on Duke's collar. Leave it on the table. Mason stared at the dog, then at Nathan. For a second, the old order of things tried to return. Mason giving instructions. Nathan absorbing them in silence. Rebecca standing between both men, wishing peace could be bought by saying nothing. But the cabin had warmed enough now for hidden doors to open, and Nathan felt something inside him do the same. Mason laid the map down. You cannot maintain this place, he said. You do not have the money. You do not have the credit. You barely have a plan. Nathan nodded once. All true. That answer seemed to annoy Mason more than an argument would have. Nathan continued, But Dad left it to me. Dad left you the worst part because he felt sorry for you. The words fell hard, and even Mason seemed to know he had spoken them too plainly. Rebecca closed her eyes. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Nathan thought it would hurt more. Maybe it had hurt for so many years that hearing it aloud simply gave the wound a name. Duke leaned against his leg, warm and steady. Nathan picked up the old photograph from the table and turned it toward Rebecca. Do you remember this? Rebecca stepped closer. Her face softened instantly. That is you. First snow on Coal Ridge. Age 7. She took the photograph gently, as if the paper might bruise. I forgot this existed. So did I. Mason looked uncomfortable. Old pictures do not change land value. Rebecca ignored him. Her thumb moved over the image of Walter standing behind little Nathan on the cabin porch. Dad brought you here? Nathan nodded. Apparently. She looked around the room differently then. Not at the sagging shelf or the patched window, but at the space where a father and son had once stood before silence swallowed both of them. I always thought this was just Dad's hunting cabin. Duke suddenly moved toward the door, ears lifting. Not toward the front porch, but the back corner where a narrow mudroom opened to a smaller rear door Nathan had not used yet. The dog sniffed the threshold, then looked back. Rebecca noticed. What is he doing? Finding what people miss, Nathan said. He took the lantern from the table and opened the rear door. Cold air entered carrying the smell of snow, pine needles, and old cedar. Behind the cabin, half hidden by drifts and blackberry canes, stood a small shed Nathan had seen only from a distance the night before. Its roof was low, its door nearly swallowed by vines, its single window clouded white with age. Duke trotted through the snow toward it, each step certain. Nathan followed, and after a moment Rebecca came too. Mason stayed in the doorway, then cursed softly under his breath and trailed behind them. The stranger by the truck watched with interest but did not approach. At the shed door, Duke stopped and pressed his nose to the lower corner. Nathan pulled away brittle vines and found another compass mark carved into the frame. Beneath it, a child's uneven letters had been scratched into the wood. N.C. First snow. Age 7. Rebecca inhaled sharply. Nathan! He stared at the carving. The lines were crude, shallow, unmistakably made by a small hand. His hand. He did not remember carving it, but his fingers ached as though the memory lived in them anyway. Mason's face had lost some of its certainty. This does not prove anything. It proves he brought me here, Nathan said quietly. It proves he remembered. The shed door was locked, but the brass key from the north wall fit. Nathan turned it, and the lock opened with a soft click that seemed much louder in the snowy quiet. Inside, the air smelled of cedar shavings, oil, and cold iron. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A workbench stood beneath the window. On it lay a folded canvas tarp, a box of carpenter's pencils, and an old ledger book wrapped in brown paper. Duke did not go to the workbench. He walked straight to the far corner, sat on the floorboards, and stared down. Nathan moved the lantern closer. Under the dog's paws was a square trapdoor, nearly invisible except for a thin iron pull ring recessed into the wood. Mason stepped forward quickly. Hold on. Nobody opens anything until we call Helen. Nathan looked at him, then at Rebecca. Snowlight came through the dirty window and touched her face, pale with confusion and hope. She did not tell him to stop. Nathan set the lantern on the bench and wrapped his hand around the iron ring. The old floor lifted with a deep wooden sigh, releasing a breath of cool dry air from below. A narrow stairway descended beneath the shed, lined with stone and cedar beams, far too carefully built to be an accident. Duke looked down into the quiet darkness, then back at Nathan with the same calm loyal expression he had worn since the first plank in the cabin came loose. Mason had no words now. Rebecca whispered, "What did Dad build under here?" Nathan lifted the lantern, and its light reached the first few steps. "I think," he said, feeling the cabin, the ridge, and the forgotten boy inside him all listening at once. "He built the part of the inheritance nobody was supposed to laugh at." Nathan went first, holding the lantern low so the light could find each step before his boot did. The stairs beneath the shed were narrow but solid, built from cedar planks that had darkened with age yet showed no sign of rot. Cool air rose from below, clean and dry, carrying the scent of stone dust, old paper, and wood shavings sealed away from weather. Duke moved ahead of him with careful confidence, his silver-gray and cream coat catching the lantern glow in soft bands. Rebecca followed close behind, one hand brushing the wall, her breath quiet but uneven. Mason came last, though not because anyone asked him to. His footsteps were slower now. The certainty he had brought from the truck had not survived the sound of that hidden door opening. At the bottom, the stairway widened into a room that should not have existed under a forgotten shed on a ridge everyone called worthless. Fieldstone walls curved around them in a clean rectangle, fitted so tightly that not even snow melt had found a way inside. Cedar beams crossed the low ceiling. Along one side stood shelves filled with rolled maps, binders, soil reports, sealed jars of tree seeds, and neat stacks of letters tied with string. On the opposite wall hung framed photographs of the ridge through many seasons, walnut trees in summer leaf, snow-bending pine branches, Walter Cole standing beside survey stakes, a younger Nathan on the cabin steps holding a red knit hat in both hands. Rebecca walked to that photograph as if pulled by a thread. "He kept this one too," she whispered. Nathan did not answer. His eyes had gone to the long table in the center of the room. On it rested a ledger book, a green metal cash box, 3 folders marked Coal Ridge Conservation, and a sealed envelope with his name written across the front in Walter's unmistakable block letters. Duke sat beside the table, ears upright, calm loyal expression fixed on Nathan as though the dog knew this was the part that would matter most. Mason crossed the room quickly, reaching for one of the folders. "We should take these to Helen before anyone starts making assumptions." Rebecca turned on him, not loudly, but firmly enough that he stopped. "Mason, for once, let him open something that has his name on it." The words surprised all three of them. Even Rebecca seemed startled by her own voice. Outside, above them, wind moved across the shed and made the old boards creak like a ship at anchor. Nathan picked up the envelope. His fingers felt thick, clumsy, as if the paper weighed more than it should. He opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Walter had written in blue ink, the lines slightly uneven but clear. "Nathan, if Duke has brought you this far, then the cabin did what I needed it to do. It made you stay long enough to listen. I know what Mason thought of it. I know what others thought too. Maybe I let them think that because I was too tired to explain what matters to people who only measure land by what can be sold." Nathan paused, and the room held still. Mason looked away first. Rebecca stood beside the photograph, one hand over her mouth. Nathan read on. "This ridge is not poor land. It is protected land. Your grandfather almost sold the walnut stand in 1989, but your mother made me promise to keep it whole. Later, when you were overseas, a foundation offered to help turn the ridge into a healing retreat if the land stayed intact. I was proud, but I was slow. Then I got sick." Nathan lowered the letter for a moment. He had not known Walter was sick until near the end. No one had called until decisions had already been made and apologies had grown too heavy to move. Duke pressed his shoulder gently against Nathan's leg, grounding him without demanding anything. Nathan continued. "The papers are here. The easement, the timber assessment, the grant agreement, the trust account, and the letters I never sent. The value is close to $2 million, but do not let that number fool you. The money is not the secret. The secret is what the place can become if the right person refuses to sell it." Mason's voice came out quieter than before. "$2 million?" The words sounded small in the underground room, almost out of place among the photographs and cedar beams. Nathan did not look at him. He turned the page. "I left you the cabin because you would know what it means to need shelter without wanting pity. I left Mason what he would understand. I left Rebecca what she could care for. But I left you the door, because when you were 7, you asked if cabins could remember people. I told you I did not know. I was wrong. This one remembered you better than I did." The last sentence moved through Nathan like cold water and fire at once. He stood very still, the letter trembling just enough for the lantern light to catch it. Rebecca began to cry silently, not with shame alone, but with the ache of discovering their father had been more complicated than any of them had allowed him to be. Mason opened one folder with careful fingers now, no longer grabbing. Inside were survey maps, photographs of the Walnut Grove, correspondence from the Northwoods Veterans Renewal Foundation, and a formal pledge of matching funds if Coal Ridge was preserved for therapeutic lodging, skills workshops, and short-term retreats for veterans rebuilding their lives. There were budget notes in Walter's handwriting: roof repair, water line, accessible ramp, for sleeping cabins, trail markers, Duke-friendly rule if Nathan agrees. Rebecca saw that last note and gave a broken little laugh through her tears. Duke tilted his head, as if accepting the honor with dignity. Nathan folded the letter slowly. "He never told me." Rebecca wiped her cheek. "He never told any of us." Mason looked older in the lantern light. The clean confidence had drained from his face, leaving only a man confronted by the poverty of his own assumptions. "I thought he gave you junk," he said. Nathan looked around the room, at the maps, the letters, the old photographs, the hidden work of a father who had spoken too late, but not falsely. "So did I." For a long while, none of them moved. The underground room seemed to breathe around them, cedar and stone holding the silence with unexpected kindness. Then Duke rose and walked toward a narrow wooden door at the far end, one they had not noticed yet. He touched it once with his nose and looked back. Nathan almost smiled despite the heaviness in his chest. Still not finished? The dog's amber eyes remained steady. Rebecca picked up the lantern from the table and held it beside Nathan. This time Mason did not object. Together, they opened the small door. Beyond it was not another treasure room, not gold, not cash, not anything that would satisfy a greedy heart. It was a simple workshop, brightened by a skylight tube that carried pale winter light from somewhere above. There were 4 unfinished wooden signs leaning against the wall. The first had already been carved in Walter's hand, Coal Ridge Haven. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a line Nathan had to read twice before he could breathe around it. For the ones still trying to come home. The workshop beyond the small wooden door changed the room more than the papers had, because papers could prove value, but unfinished signs proved intention. Nathan stood beneath the pale winter light that came down through the narrow skylight tube, reading the words his father had carved and never hung. Coleridge Haven. For the ones still trying to come home. The letters were not perfect. Some edges were rough, some curves uneven, and in 2 places Walter had clearly stopped and started again, leaving faint marks where the blade had slipped. Yet there was more tenderness in those imperfect lines than Nathan had found in years of formal apologies never spoken. Rebecca touched the sign with 2 fingers. "He was making this by hand," she said. Her voice carried wonder and sorrow together. "He could have ordered one." Nathan looked at the workbench, where wood shavings still lay curled like pale ribbons. "That was not Dad." Mason stood in the doorway, quiet now, his polished boots planted on the cedar floor as if he was afraid to move too quickly and break whatever fragile truth had entered the room. Duke walked around the workshop, sniffing the base of the bench, the stacked lumber, the jars of nails, then settled beside a low shelf where 4 smaller plaques rested face down. Nathan lifted the first one. It read Cabin 1. The second read Quiet Trail. The third read Workshop. The fourth was unfinished, but pencil lines showed where Walter had planned the words Memory Grove. Rebecca wiped her cheek and gave a small breath. "The walnut stand." Nathan nodded. He could see it now, not as acreage, not as timber value, but as a place where men and women could walk without needing to explain why they preferred trees to crowded rooms. Duke rested his chin on the shelf, calm and watchful, as though the dog approved of the plan exactly as Walter had left it. They returned to the main underground room slowly, bringing the first sign with them. The land broker outside had grown impatient and finally come to the shed door, calling Mason's name into the snowy air. Mason climbed the stairs first, not with authority this time, but with the look of a man about to face his own reflection in daylight. Nathan followed with the letter folded in his pocket, Rebecca beside him carrying the carved sign, and Duke emerging last, his silver gray and cream coat bright against the dim shed. The broker glanced at the sign and then at Mason. "Are we still looking at the ridge?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, Nathan expected the old Mason to return, the one who could turn discomfort into dismissal. But Mason looked toward the cabin, then to the snow-covered trees beyond it, and shook his head. "Not today." The broker frowned. "You said there may be value here." Mason looked at Nathan, and the words came out with effort. "There is." The broker waited. Mason added, "Just not the kind you came to buy." That did not heal the years between them. It did not erase the laugh in Helen Brooks's office or the way Nathan had been made to feel like the leftovers of the family. But it was the first honest thing Mason had said all day, and honest things, even small ones, could become a plank in a bridge if no one kicked it loose. The broker left with a stiff nod, tires crunching down the ridge road until the sound faded under the trees. Snow kept falling, finer now, touching the cabin roof, the shed, the old stumps, and the quiet path that led toward the walnut grove. Back inside the cabin, the fire had burned low again. Rebecca set the carved sign on the table beside the metal plate, the map, and the photograph of Nathan at 7. Mason remained standing near the door, his gloves in his hands. "I did not know," he said. Nathan looked at him. "No," Mason swallowed. "But I did not ask either." That was closer to an apology than Nathan had expected, and because it was not decorated, because it did not excuse itself, it reached him more deeply than a longer speech might have. Rebecca sat at the table and opened one of the folders from the underground room. The foundation letter says the matching funds are still possible if the conservation easement remains intact and the property is not subdivided. Nathan leaned over the paper. How old is that letter? Last year, she said. Dad renewed the application. Mason stepped closer. Helen will know what needs to happen. Nathan looked out the window, where Duke had gone to sit on the porch, facing the trees as if listening to the ridge breathe beneath its snow blanket. This will take more than papers. Rebecca nodded. Roof repairs. Water. Heat. Access road. Insurance. She looked up at him. And somebody who understands why this matters. Nathan almost answered that he was not qualified. That he had no degree, no savings, no polished way of speaking to foundations or county boards. But the words would not come. Maybe because the cabin had already rejected the old story he told himself. Maybe because Walter's letter was still warm in his pocket. Maybe because Duke turned just then and looked through the window at him with that steady loyal expression, as if the dog had already decided the matter. I know what it feels like to need a place and not know how to ask, Nathan said. That may be a start. Rebecca's eyes softened. Mason looked down at the floor. The afternoon faded early behind the ridge, bringing a blue dust that settled into the snow and turned the cabin windows into mirrors. They called Helen Brooks from the old landline after Nathan found it still worked. The attorney listened in silence as Rebecca explained the hidden room, the letters, the conservation papers, the foundation grant, the trust account, and the sign. When Rebecca finished, Helen exhaled so slowly that the sound carried across the line. Your father told me there was more up there, she said. He said the right person would find it only if the dog agreed. Nathan glanced at Duke, who had come back inside and was now lying beside the hearth, paws crossed, dignified as a judge. Helen continued, Bring everything to my office tomorrow. Do not sign anything with anyone else. Do not let anyone pressure you. Walter was careful, but careful still needs witnesses. After the call, Mason offered to drive back to town and return in the morning with legal boxes. Rebecca said she would stay at the cabin if Nathan allowed it, not because she wanted to claim anything, but because she wanted to remember what the family had forgotten. Nathan hesitated only a moment before nodding. Mason paused at the door before leaving. Nathan, he said, and the name sounded different now, less like a formality and more like a beginning. I was wrong about the cabin. Nathan stood by the table, the carved sign between them. So was I. Mason left without another word. When the truck disappeared down the road, the ridge grew quiet again. Rebecca made coffee while Nathan added wood to the fire. Duke slept with one ear turned toward the floor, still listening, perhaps, to all the hidden places men build when they do not know how to speak love plainly. Later, Nathan stepped onto the porch alone. Snow lay soft over the road, covering the tracks that had come and gone. The walnut grove stood beyond the cabin, dark and patient against the evening sky. For the first time since the will was read, Nathan did not feel sent away. He felt placed. There was a difference. Being sent away meant exile. Being placed meant purpose. Behind him, through the cabin window, the sign Coal Ridge Haven rested in the lamplight, waiting for hands that would finish what Walter had begun. Nathan looked down as Duke came to stand beside him, warm shoulder against his leg. Looks like we are staying, he said. Duke gave one quiet breath into the cold, and the ridge seemed to answer. Morning on Coal Ridge arrived white and blue, with sunlight lying across the snow like a blessing too quiet to announce itself. Nathan woke before Rebecca, before the fire had fully surrendered to ash, before the wind started combing through the pines outside the cabin. Duke was already awake, lying beside the hearth with his head raised and his upright ears turned toward the door, not troubled, only attentive, the way he listened when the world was about to ask something of them. Nathan dressed in the dim light, his worn dark field jacket stiff from yesterday's cold, his plain cotton shirt wrinkled from sleep, his faded jeans dusted with wood ash at the knees. He stood for a moment by the table, looking at the things they had found: the metal plate, the folded map, the photograph of himself as a boy, Walter's letter, the brass key, and the carved sign that read Coal Ridge Haven. In daylight, the sign seemed less like a secret and more like a responsibility. Rebecca came down from the loft wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her tired face, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. The cabin did that to people now. It made silence feel useful. She made coffee while Nathan packed the papers into a crate, each folder laid flat, each photograph wrapped carefully, each letter returned to its envelope. Duke watched every movement from beside the hearth, as if keeping inventory in his own quiet way. By 8 o'clock, Mason's black truck returned up the snowy ridge road, carrying 3 legal boxes, a roll of plastic sheeting, and an expression that looked like a man trying to learn humility without instructions. He did not make jokes about the cabin. He did not mention selling. He only stepped onto the porch, looked at Nathan, and said, "Helen is expecting us at 10. The drive into Pine Hollow was slow, 7 miles down the ridge through roads still packed with snow and lined with pines that glittered in the morning light. Nathan drove his old pickup with Duke in the passenger seat, the crate of documents secured behind them. Rebecca rode with Mason, and every so often Nathan saw their truck in the mirror, following at a respectful distance. It felt strange, being followed instead of left behind. Helen Brooks's office sat above the town pharmacy, in a brick building that smelled of old paper, floor polish, and winter coats drying on hooks. Helen met them at the door herself, silver hair pinned neatly, glasses hanging from a chain, her face stern until she saw Duke. "Well," she said, looking down at the German shepherd, "I suppose you are the executor of the truth." Duke sat politely, amber eyes calm, and Helen opened the door wider. For the next 3 hours, the small conference room became a place where Walter Cole's silence was translated into documents. Helen read the conservation easement first, then the foundation pledge, then the trust account records, then the timber assessment from a certified forester who had valued the walnut grove, not for cutting, but as part of a preserved heritage stand. The total projected value, including the grant, land protection incentives, and trust funding, came to just over $2 million if Coal Ridge remained intact and the retreat project moved forward. Mason sat very still when Helen said the number. Rebecca stared at the table. Nathan looked out the window at the courthouse clock across the street, because numbers that large did not feel real to a man who had counted gas money in quarters. Helen tapped the papers into a neat stack. "The money is restricted," she said. "Walter made sure of that. It cannot simply be taken and spent. It supports the land, the cabin, the access road, the retreat structures, and operating needs tied to the mission." Mason rubbed both hands over his face. "So even if someone wanted to sell it, they would spend years untangling protections your father very intentionally tied," Helen said. Her tone was dry, but not unkind. "Walter may not have been talkative, but he was not careless." Nathan looked down at Walter's final letter, now lying open before him. "I left you the door." The words had followed him all morning. Helen turned to Nathan. "Legally, the cabin and ridge are yours. Morally, I suspect Walter hoped you would choose what to build with them. The foundation will require a steward, a board, inspections, insurance, and a plan. Nothing opens overnight." "Good," Nathan said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He folded his hands on the table. Things that matter should not open overnight. Helen's expression softened by one small degree. Rebecca nodded, her eyes bright. Mason leaned back and looked toward Duke, who lay under the table with his head on Nathan's boot. "Dad really trusted the dog?" Helen almost smiled. "Your father said people explain too much when they want something. A good dog just tells you where to look." By late afternoon, they returned to the ridge with more questions than answers, but the questions had shape now. That mattered. Mason carried boxes into the cabin without being asked. Rebecca made a list of immediate repairs. Nathan walked to the shed with Duke and opened the underground room again, not to search, but but to see it honestly in the light of what Helen had confirmed. The cedar beams. The maps. The unfinished signs. The careful shelves. The place did not feel like a treasure room anymore. It felt like a seed cellar. Everything valuable was waiting to become useful. As the sun lowered behind the pines, Nathan found one more envelope tucked beneath the ledger on the workbench. It was not addressed to him. It was addressed to whoever comes here tired. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single page in Walter's handwriting. This ridge will not fix a life in one night. No place can. But it can offer a bed that does not ask questions, a trail quiet enough for prayer, a workbench for hands that need purpose, and a morning where someone wakes up and realizes the world did not end while they slept. Nathan stood still, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Duke pressed close to his leg, warm and steady. Above them, through the shed floor, Rebecca's footsteps crossed the cabin porch, and Mason's voice called that the firewood stack had fallen but could be rebuilt. Nathan looked at the unfinished sign leaning against the wall, then at the letter, then at the dog who had led him through every locked place without once doubting he belonged there. Outside, evening settled blue over Coal Ridge. The cabin window glowed with firelight. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, faithful line. And for the first time in many years, Nathan did not wonder why he had been given the smallest thing. He wondered how many people might one day find it large enough to save them. The next week did not arrive like a miracle. It arrived with frozen pipes, a roof patch that failed before noon, a county checklist thick enough to humble anyone, and 3 people learning that a dream could be holy and still require a hammer. Nathan spent the mornings on the ridge with Duke beside him, measuring doorways, clearing snow from the shed path, sealing gaps in the cabin wall, and marking trees along the quiet trail Walter had mapped in blue pencil. He was still the same man who had come there with one old pickup, a worn dark field jacket, a plain cotton shirt, faded jeans, and no expectation of being wanted. But something in the way he moved had changed. He no longer worked like a man trying to earn permission to stay. He worked like a man entrusted with a place that had already spoken his name. Rebecca came up from town every day with supplies in the back of her car, contractor bags, notebooks, rolls of insulation, coffee, sandwiches wrapped in foil, and once, unexpectedly, a bundle of red yarn she said was for marking the trail until proper signs could be made. Mason came too, though he never announced it with warmth. He brought lumber, a borrowed generator, and a stack of old invoices from Walter's files. He still spoke in practical sentences, still measured problems in cost and labor, but he had stopped calling the cabin worthless. That silence was its own apology. Duke treated all of them as workers under his supervision. He walked the property lines with Nathan, sat beside Rebecca while she sorted foundation forms, and watched Mason from the porch until Mason finally muttered, "All right, I am carrying the boards," which seemed to satisfy the dog completely. On Thursday afternoon, Helen Brooks drove up the ridge with a thermos of black coffee and a retired carpenter named Samuel Pike, a narrow-shouldered man in his 70s with white hair, a canvas tool roll, and eyes that watered in the cold but missed nothing. The moment Samuel stepped out of Helen's car, he looked at the cabin, then at the shed, then at the walnut grove beyond the rise. His face changed. "Walter brought me here once," he said. Nathan set down the plank he was carrying. "You knew about this place?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Some. Not all. He asked me to help frame the underground room years ago. Told me it was storage. Later, I figured it was more than that, but Walter had a way of keeping a man from prying without making him feel pushed out." Rebecca came down the porch steps, her expression careful. "Did he ever say why he kept it secret?" Samuel looked toward the pines, where snow slid softly from the branches. "He said some places need quiet while they are becoming what they are meant to be." The words settled over the yard, and Nathan felt again that strange ache of learning his father after losing him. Samuel worked slowly but with perfect certainty. He inspected the cabin roof, the shed stairs, the cedar beams below, the old window frames, and the porch rail. He ran his hand over Walter's carved sign and nodded once, almost to himself. He never could make his curves clean, he said. But he carved like he meant every letter. By late afternoon, they had a list. Replace 3 roof beams. Build a safer rear entrance. Add handrails to the underground stairs. Install proper heat. Clear the old spring line. Restore the trail without disturbing the walnut roots. It was more work than Nathan had hoped and less than he had feared. Helen stood at the kitchen table, writing notes in a legal pad while Rebecca compared them with the foundation requirements. Mason leaned against the counter, tired and quiet. "This is going to take months," he said. Nathan looked around the cabin. The firelight moved over the log walls, the compass mark near the north panel, the photograph of himself at 7 now resting on the mantel. "Then it takes months." Rebecca looked up from her notes and smiled faintly. That sounded like Dad. Mason almost smiled too, but caught himself and looked at the floor. Duke rose suddenly from beside the hearth and walked to the door. His ears lifted, but there was no concern in his posture. Only recognition. Nathan opened the door and saw a woman standing near the porch steps with a paper grocery bag in her arms. She was in her 60s, wearing a navy parka and snow boots, her cheeks red from the climb up the ridge. Behind her, parked carefully near the road, was an old green station wagon. "I am looking for Nathan Cole," she said. Nathan stepped onto the porch. "That is me." She looked at Duke first, then at the cabin, then back at Nathan. "My name is Clara Whitcomb. Your father helped my son here a long time ago. I heard in town that the ridge might open again." No one moved for a moment. Even the wind seemed to pause in the pines. Clara lifted the grocery bag slightly, embarrassed by her own offering. "It is just canned soup, coffee, and some wool socks. I did not know what you needed." Rebecca's eyes filled before she could turn away. Helen took off her glasses and cleaned them though they were not dirty. Nathan accepted the bag with both hands, because it felt too important to take casually. "Thank you," he said. Clara looked past him into the warm cabin. "My son stayed here 2 nights after he came home. He would not talk to anyone then. Walter gave him coffee, let him stack firewood, and never asked him to explain himself. That saved more than Walter ever knew." Nathan held the bag against his chest. Duke stepped forward and gently touched his nose to Clara's glove. She smiled through tears and placed her hand on the dog's head. "You found it, did you?" she whispered. Duke's tail moved once, slow and dignified. That evening, after Clara left and the others had grown quiet, Nathan carried the supplies into the underground room. He placed the coffee on the shelf, the soup beside the old jars, and the wool socks in a clear bin Walter had labeled winter. It was the first new donation Coal Ridge Haven had received in years. Not a check. Not a headline. Not a miracle with trumpets. Just soup, socks, and a woman who remembered kindness long enough to return it. Nathan stood beneath the unfinished sign, feeling the room change again. The past was no longer only being discovered. It was beginning to answer back. Duke sat beside him, amber eyes reflecting the lantern. Above them, footsteps crossed the cabin floor, Rebecca making coffee, Mason stacking tools, Samuel laughing softly at something Helen said. The ridge was not restored yet. The retreat was not open. The paperwork was not complete. But a shelf that had waited in silence now held something new. Nathan looked at the bin marked winter and thought of every cold night when a pair of dry socks would have felt like grace. He rested his hand on Duke's head. "We will do it right," he said. The dog leaned into him, warm and certain, and somewhere beyond the stone walls, the walnut grove stood in the blue dark, guarding the promise a little longer. By the second Saturday after the hidden room was found, Coal Ridge no longer looked abandoned, though it still looked humble enough to tell the truth. The snow had begun to soften around the edges, sliding from the cabin roof in slow white folds and dripping from pine branches whenever the sun touched them. Nathan stood at the edge of the porch before sunrise, his breath pale in the cold, Duke sitting beside him with upright ears and alert amber eyes turned toward the road. The ridge was quiet, but not empty. That was the difference. Inside the cabin, Rebecca had fallen asleep at the table over a stack of grant forms, her pen still in her hand. Mason had spent the night in his truck rather than drive down the icy road after dark, and at dawn Nathan found him outside splitting firewood with steady, wordless determination. Samuel Pike arrived shortly after breakfast carrying a box of old brass hooks he said Walter had meant to use for coats. Helen Brooks came with paperwork, coffee, and the kind of stern look that meant hope was allowed but deadlines were not optional. By noon, the cabin had become a small workshop of purpose. Rebecca cleaned the old windows until winter light poured through them. Mason and Samuel repaired the porch rail and framed the safer entrance behind the shed. Helen sat by the hearth, calling county offices, the foundation, the insurance agent, and one very confused electrician who kept asking whether the cabin was residential, charitable, historical, or all three. Helen finally answered, "It is becoming what it should have been," and wrote that down as if it were a legal category. Nathan worked mostly outside, clearing the path to the walnut grove with Duke moving ahead of him. The dog paused at every trail marker Walter had once sketched on the old map, as though the blue pencil lines had a scent. Red yarn fluttered from branches where Rebecca had tied it, bright against the snow. The grove itself stood beyond a low rise, older and quieter than Nathan expected. The walnut trees were not enormous in the showy way of tourist forests. They were dignified, rooted deep, their dark limbs reaching into the white sky with the patience of things that had outlasted arguments, seasons, and men who thought land only mattered when it could be divided. Nathan stopped beneath the first tree and placed his palm against the bark. It was cold, rough, alive. For years, he had believed inheritance meant what someone handed you after they were gone. Now he wondered if the truest inheritance was what someone trusted you not to destroy. Duke sat in the snow at the base of the tree and looked down the trail toward the cabin. Nathan followed his gaze. Through the pines, he could see smoke lifting from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon. It looked like the cabin was breathing again. In the afternoon, Clara Whitcomb returned, and she was not alone. Behind her came 3 cars, then a church van, then an old pickup with a cracked windshield and a bed full of folded quilts. People stepped out carefully onto the packed snow, carrying practical kindness in brown bags, cardboard boxes, laundry baskets, and gloved hands. Some Nathan recognized from town. Most he did not. A retired school nurse brought first aid supplies. A grocery store owner brought canned goods and flour. A young pastor brought extra cots from a youth camp storage room. A woman whose husband had once stayed on the ridge brought a stack of handwritten thank you notes that had never been mailed because Walter had always refused public praise. Each person seemed to carry one small piece of a story Nathan had never heard. Walter gave my brother work for a week. Eleanor sent blankets after the flood. Your father paid for my son's bus ticket home. The cabin gave my uncle one quiet night when he needed it most. Nathan accepted every word the way he accepted the supplies, with both hands carefully, because gratitude could be heavy when it arrived all at once. Rebecca stood near the porch with tears freezing at the corners of her smile, writing names into a new ledger titled Coal Ridge Haven Donations. Mason carried boxes without complaint, and when an older man thanked him for keeping Walter's promise alive, Mason looked as if the words had found a place in him that still did not know how to answer. Duke moved among the visitors with calm loyalty, allowing pats, sniffing packages, sitting beside anyone who looked unsure of where to stand. More than once, someone bent to him and whispered, "Good boy," as if they understood he had not merely found a room beneath the shed. He had found the road back to the better part of a family. Near sunset, Helen called everyone into the yard. The repaired porch steps were dusted clean. The carved sign Walter had made, Coal Ridge Haven, rested across 2 sawhorses while Samuel brushed on a clear protective coat. No one wanted to repaint the letters. Rebecca said the uneven curves were part of her father's hand, and Nathan agreed. When the final coat dried enough to lift, Mason took one end of the sign and Nathan took the other. For a moment they stood on opposite sides of their father's unfinished work, 2 brothers who had spent years measuring themselves against silence, now holding the same piece of wood between them. They carried it to the new entrance behind the shed. Samuel climbed the small ladder and set the hooks. Nathan and Mason lifted the sign into place. Rebecca stood below with Duke at her side, one hand resting on the German shepherd's strong neck. Helen adjusted the sign by half an inch, because she was Helen, and then Samuel tightened the last screw. The words settled above the doorway as if they had been waiting for that exact light. Coleridge Haven. For the ones still trying to come home. No one applauded at first. The ridge was too quiet for that. Then Clara began to clap softly, and others joined, not loud, not celebratory in the ordinary way, but with a tenderness that made the sound feel like rain after drought. Nathan looked at the sign until the letters blurred slightly. He thought of Walter carving them alone, maybe tired, maybe sorry, maybe hoping one day his son would stand beneath them and understand what had been too hard to say face to face. Rebecca stepped beside Nathan. "He saw you," she said. Nathan did not answer immediately. Across the yard, Duke sat beneath the sign, posture proud, amber eyes shining in the last light. Mason came to Nathan's other side, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I should have seen you too," he said. The apology was quiet. It did not ask to be forgiven quickly. That made it easier to hear. Nathan looked out toward the walnut grove, where twilight gathered blue among the trunks. "We have work to do," he said. Mason nodded. "I know." Inside the underground room, the new donations filled the shelves that had waited in silence for years. Soup beside soup. Socks in the winter bin. Quilts folded at the foot of clean cots. Coffee near the old enamel mugs. On the long table, Helen placed the first approval letter from the foundation, conditional but real. Rebecca placed Eleanor's old photograph beside it. Nathan placed Walter's letter under the carved sign's pencil sketch. Duke lay near the stairs, finally resting, one ear still turned toward the world above. That night, after everyone left except family, the cabin glowed against the snow with a warmth that reached beyond the windows. Nathan stood on the porch, listening to Mason stacking the last firewood, Rebecca humming softly inside, and Duke breathing at his feet. The ridge had not become whole in a week. Neither had the family. But something had opened, and sometimes grace did not complete the work in one moment. Sometimes it simply unlocked the door, lights the hearth, and gathers enough hands to begin. The first official morning at Coleridge Haven did not feel official at all. It felt like coffee warming on the stove, frost shining on the porch rail, and Duke sleeping beneath the new sign as if he had been guarding that doorway his entire life. The foundation approval was still conditional, the county inspection still ahead, the insurance still complicated, and the road still rough enough to make every visitor slow down before reaching the cabin. But something had changed that no form could measure. The ridge had stopped being a forgotten corner of the Cole estate. It had become a place people spoke about softly, the way they spoke about churches, old friends, and roads that had brought them home in bad weather. Nathan stood outside before sunrise, a white male veteran with a calm, weathered face, short brown hair, light stubble, wearing his worn dark field jacket, plain cotton shirt, and faded jeans, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee while smoke lifted from the chimney into the pale sky. The snow had hardened overnight, turning the path to the walnut grove into a silver ribbon. Duke rose when Nathan shifted his weight, the 6-year-old German shepherd strong and steady, silver-gray and cream coat bright in the dawn, upright ears angled toward the trees, alert amber eyes calm with that loyal expression Nathan had trusted longer than he had trusted most people. Inside the cabin, Rebecca moved quietly through the kitchen, placing clean mugs on the table beside the new ledger. Mason was outside near the shed, fixing the latch on the entrance to the underground room, not because anyone had asked him, but because he had seen it loose the night before and had come back early with the right screws. That was how change looked in their family now. Not speeches. Not sudden perfection. Just people returning with tools. Helen Brooks arrived at 8 with another folder and Samuel Pike in the passenger seat, both of them carrying the brisk energy of people who believed hope should have paperwork and handrails. Clara Wickham came soon after with a pot of stew wrapped in towels, and by mid-morning the cabin smelled of cedar smoke, coffee, stew, and fresh-cut lumber. The first room was ready before noon. It was not fancy. A clean cot, a wool blanket, a small lamp, a shelf, a chair, and a window facing the trees. Rebecca placed a folded note on the shelf that said, "Rest here. No one will rush you." She worried the words were too simple, but Nathan shook his head. "Simple is easier to believe." Duke walked into the room, sniffed the blanket, circled once, and sat beside the cot with solemn approval. Samuel looked down at him and said, "Well, that passes inspection." Even Helen smiled. In the afternoon, a call came through Helen's office from the County Veterans Outreach Coordinator. A man passing through Pine Hollow needed one quiet night before his sister could pick him up from 2 towns over. Nothing dramatic. No ceremony. Just a tired traveler, a delayed ride, and bad weather moving in after sunset. Helen looked at Nathan across the cabin table. "You are not fully opened yet," she said. Nathan looked toward the first room, then at Duke, then at the window where clouds had begun folding over the ridge. "Is the bed clean?" Rebecca nodded. "Is the heat working?" Mason answered from the doorway. "It is holding steady." Nathan set down his coffee. "Then we can be kind before we are official." The man arrived near dusk in a county car, carrying one duffel and wearing a coat too thin for the mountain air. His name was Paul, though he offered it as if it might be safer not to be remembered. He looked around the cabin with the careful eyes of someone who had slept in places where welcome always had conditions. Nathan did not ask for his story. He only took the duffel, showed him the room, and said supper would be ready whenever he wanted it. Duke followed at a respectful distance, then sat outside the door, not blocking it, simply keeping watch. Paul looked down at him. "Friendly?" Nathan said. "He knows when to give people space." Something in that answer eased the man's shoulders. At supper, Paul ate slowly, as if the warmth might disappear if he trusted it too quickly. Rebecca poured coffee. Mason passed bread. Clara told a harmless story about Walter once burning oatmeal so badly the pot had to be buried behind the shed. Samuel claimed he remembered the pot. Helen said she could not confirm or deny legal responsibility for it. The laughter that followed was gentle, and Paul smiled without meaning to. Nathan watched from the end of the table, feeling the room become what Walter had described in his letter. A bed that did not ask questions. A trail quiet enough for prayer. A workbench for hands that needed purpose. A morning where someone could wake and realize the world had not ended while they slept. Later, after Paul had gone to rest, Nathan stepped outside with Duke. Snow had begun again, falling slowly through the porch light. The carved sign hung above the entrance behind the shed, its letters protected now but still bearing every uneven mark from Walter's hands. Coleridge Haven. For the ones still trying to come home. Rebecca joined Nathan on the porch, pulling her coat tight. Mason came a moment later, carrying 2 extra logs for the fire even though the wood box was full. For a while, the 3 of them stood without speaking, watching snow cover the road that had once made the cabin feel separate from the world. "I used to think Dad forgot how to love us," Rebecca said. Mason looked at the ground. Nathan watched the sign through the snowfall. "Maybe he forgot how to say it where we could hear." Duke leaned against Nathan's leg, warm and certain. Rebecca slipped her hand into Mason's arm, not forgiveness fully, but family beginning again in the only way it could, by standing in the same weather. Near midnight, Nathan walked once more to the underground room. The shelves held new supplies. The first ledger entry had been written in Rebecca's careful hand, Paul, 1 night, winter storm, room 1. No questions asked? Nathan placed Walter's final letter in a wooden box beneath the signed sketch, then added the metal plate from the cabin floor beside it. Not worthless. Just waiting. For the one who would stay. He finally understood that the words had never been only about the cabin. They had been about him. About Duke. About Rebecca and Mason. About every person who might arrive believing they had been handed the smallest portion of life, only to discover that grace sometimes hides its greatest gifts in overlooked places. When Nathan returned upstairs, Paul's room was quiet, the fire was steady, and Duke had settled by the door with one ear turned toward the night. The ridge breathed around them, pine and snow and cedar holding the silence tenderly. Nathan looked through the window toward the walnut grove, where the dark trees stood guard over a future that no one would cut down for money now. He thought of Walter carving alone, of Mason learning to carry without claiming, of Rebecca writing names into the ledger, of Clara bringing soup and socks, of Duke hearing the truth beneath old boards before any human heart was ready. Then he turned down the lamp and let the cabin glow softly behind him. The inheritance had revealed its true shape at last. It was not the $2 million, not the protected grove, not even the cabin itself. It was a place where the overlooked could be seen, where the tired could rest, where old love could become useful again, and where a faithful dog had led a wounded man back to the door that had been waiting for him all along.